For you.
Okay.
Gracias a todos por su paciencia. Vamos a empezar con la ponencia magistral del día de hoy. Hoy nos acompaña Joseph Straubhaar de la Universidad de Austin. Y antes de presentarles en forma el currículum, la semblanza de Joseph, quiero agradecerles a nombre de ULEPICC, del Centro de Estudios en Ciencias de la Comunicación, del Centro de Estudios Teóricos y Multidisciplinarios en Ciencias Sociales, su asistencia, su paciencia, que nos hayan acompañado los 3 días a este coloquio de Economía, Política y Medios Digitales para la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas. Pues es muy importante, sobre todo si consideran, ¿no?, las pláticas, las charlas que hemos tenido, no solo de nuestros ponentes magistrales, a quienes les agradecemos infinito que estén con nosotros, sino de nuestros colegas y de las personas que han estado acompañándonos día tras día. Les cuento rápidamente quién es Joseph Straubhaar. Él es profesor, les decía, de comunicaciones en el Departamento de Radio, Televisión y Cine de la Universidad de Texas, en Austin. Es el actual director del Programa de Estudios Latinoamericanos del Moody College of Communication y también es director del Centro de Estudios Brasileros en el Estudio Lozano Long. Y bueno, más bien, este cargo lo ocupó de 2003 a 2006. Sus principales intereses de investigación son los medios globales, los medios digitales, la brecha digital en los Estados Unidos y otros países, la televisión, los medios, la migración, particularmente brasileros y latinoamericanos en general, y la producción de flujo de televisión a nivel mundial. Sus clases de posgrado incluyen teoría de los medios, medios globales, medios migración, medios latinoamericanos y métodos de investigación etnográficos cualitativos. Joseph realiza investigaciones en América Latina, principalmente en países como Brasil. Él es miembro del consejo editorial de varias revistas, entre las que destacan Communication Theory, el International Journal of Communication, también el Journal of Broadcasting, ¿no?, Comunicación y Sociedad, el Chinese Journal of Communication, la revista Intercom, entre muchas otras publicaciones, ¿no? De sus publicaciones recientes está el Manual de Investigación sobre enfoques comparativos de la revolución en la era digital en Europa y las Américas. Este texto es de 2015, es de fácil acceso y sobre todo si lo buscan en internet es fácil que lo encuentren. También tiene un libro que se llama Television in Latin America, que en coautoría con John Sinclair. Este fue publicado por Routledge en 2013. Otro de sus libros es Inequality in the Technopolis. Esto es particularmente en Austin, y este lo coeditó con otros investigadores, y este está publicado en 2011. Además de numerosos artículos sobre las nuevas tecnologías de televisión, el flujo y la cultura de los medios, el particular interés de Joseph está en la migración y en Latinoamérica. Joe, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. So I offered to speak in my best Portuñol because I speak Portuguese quite well, and Spanish, okay, but they said, yeah, maybe it would be better for you to speak in English. So, okay, we will do that. I wanted to very much thank Florence and Rodrigo and all the others who helped organize this. This has been quite nice to be here and hear these debates. And, you know, I'd been actually thinking quite a bit in the last year or two about how it would be nice to get back to Mexico City. And so thank you very much. And you know, it's been quite stimulating to hear the other discussions. So I'm hoping we can have kind of an interesting discussion as well. So I wanted to sort of take something very contemporary, very, very of the moment, and kind of a part of major change, to kind of reflect on how TV is beginning to merge with new media, both, you know, globally. I obviously look at it in the United States, but it's interesting that Latin America was the first place that Netflix expanded into, actually, both Brazil and Mexico. And so I think in some ways it's interesting to look at what has happened in Latin America with this kind of newest medium. And in some ways, I think it presents a very multifaceted thing. So I think in some ways you can look at it and say, yes, this is clearly an increase of classic media imperialism. You can also look at it and saying, but it's also producing Ingobernable, other things in Brazil and elsewhere. They've just signed a contract to do 6 productions in Colombia. So it's interestingly national as well, to a much smaller scale. And I find that my argument is going to focus on a little bit. In fact, let me pick the next slide. And so, is this, in fact, primarily a new cultural imperialism? I mean, I think in some ways, we can certainly see, if you use a narrower definition of media imperialism, it's definitely a hugely increased flow of American television to the world. That's without doubt. I think in structural terms, it's almost an interesting incarnation of what Antonio Hart and Michael Hart and Antonio Negre were saying about a somewhat decentered empire, an empire primarily of technology and corporations. And so I think it's interesting to think about it that way. And certainly, I mean, I think, you know, I'm going to present some quantitative research that's been done by Ibope and Kantar Media, but I also I've been teaching graduate seminars for a long time in a couple of schools in the state of Sao Paulo. And it's been interesting to watch how they talk about it. And to them, it's very much about symbolic capital and showing off their sophistication to their friends. And they watch a great deal of the new American flow out, this supposed golden age of US TV. But one of the things I think is genuinely new about this, and in kind of both its political economic structure and in its cultural address to people. I kind of want to talk about both the form of cultural change represented here, as well as kind of another example of a new form of political economy, of what Daliang Jin calls platform imperialism. You know, that there's now suddenly these new platforms, mostly based in the United States, with huge, huge transformative capabilities. And I want to get in a little bit into the new topic of algorithmic culture, how one strong aspect of these new platforms is the way that they track and address people as individuals through this grand accumulation of data about them. And I think in many ways, part of my career has been built on looking at how culture forms certain borders and boundaries that in a way regulate TV beyond what governments can do. That simply the boundaries of language and culture in many ways have protected places like Latin America. So here's my attempt. I'm not really good with diagrams. I don't have a great talent for coming up with innovative circles and arrows and things, but here's my attempt. So if you look kind of the upper left, I mean, and I want to look at this historically. I mean, probably one of the very dominant facts that goes all the way back to the 1910s, really, with the film industry, and the 1960s, certainly with the TV industry, is there's been this huge historical dominance by the United States, by Hollywood. And that continues. But one of the things that I began to notice in my career, I'd gone to Brazil in 1976 expecting cultural imperialism. And my first Portuguese teacher said, well, you should become a fan of a football club. You know, buy a T-shirt, people will talk to you. And so, not knowing anything, I became a fan of Vasco da Gama, which turns out was a terrible team. But people would still talk to me about it. And said, even more importantly, you should start watching at least 2 telenovelas, because that's what everybody really talks about. And I went, oh, wow. This is not what Herb Schiller led me to expect, actually. This is, you know, it was not the cultural imperialism that I'd read about. You know, I've decided, after thinking about it a lot for 40-some years, that in many ways there was a true cultural imperialism at the level of structure. You know, these new mechanisms, and including powerful new cultural industries like TV Globo, helped consolidate consumer capitalism. So at a structural level, yes, very deeply. At a cultural level, more contested, actually. And so then I've found it profitable to think about both and try to sometimes put them together, sometimes separate them. But you could certainly see, starting in the late 60s with TV Globo, Televisa, and some others, a very strong productive capability and actually a very creative one in terms of genres and things, which then began to flow in the region. So John Sinclair and I and others began to make an argument for regional flows. Now, I think when we look at Netflix, it's interesting. This is kind of a little bit of kind of a summary, and we'll certainly go into detail. I mean, it's reinforcing that traditional media imperialism of unequal flow. Because there's an enormous amount of American TV coming out. I mean, in some ways, this technology combines with a very productive moment in Hollywood, amply defined, where a huge amount of high quality series TV is being produced. So in some ways, it's both a question of sort of the growth of cultural industry and this new technology. The thing I think I find most interesting, and then it's also doing things like local production in many places, and I think I'll talk a bit about that more. The plans are to greatly increase that, actually. So it's complex. There is this new reinforced wave of media imperialism. There is some reinforcement of the national and the regional. And the thing I think that's really new is the sort of the second arrow on the right side, that in part because of the algorithmic capabilities of these new platforms, it enables a kind of targeting of individuals. And I would say a kind of a new form of regulation of how TV works by cutting across traditional lines of culture. So we have a pretty well established tradition, particularly in Latin America, of cultural boundaries that have helped protect essentially every place but Canada and the Americas. I mean, it's terrible to be thinking about to so totally share a culture and a language with a great big neighbor. This is a very difficult thing. But for most of the Americas, language and culture has been a way of regulating and to some degree resisting cultural flows. But at least within the upper middle class who are paying attention to Netflix, suddenly there's this greatly reinforced American flow, but also I think, and this is maybe where it gets interesting both economically and culturally, I'm looking for the right word. I'm tentatively calling it transverse, because if you look at that in a scientific definition, it's something that cuts across the established channels. So if you have these established channels of American dominance on the one hand, and pretty considerable national and regional development in not only Latin America, but the Middle East, East Asia, South Asia, lots of places actually. Netflix is going to sort of reinforce those, but also pick up a lot of programming from a lot of places and send it to virtually everybody in the world, targeted very narrowly by genre and by kind of individual demographics. So, I mean, my favorite show at the moment is El Ministerio del Tiempo from Spain, because I've always liked science fiction. I've always liked time travel stories. I like Spanish history, so I am kind of the perfect audience for this one. But a lot of people with less interest in Spanish history like it just fine because it's a well-done genre show. And so it's interesting, I think, how we're going to be addressed as individuals via this very transformative algorithmic technology. So, again, I probably won't, here's, just a bit of detail for us to think about, because I'm going to show you some actual audience preference data in a minute. And it was a bit shocking to me, since I'm the guy who came up with the idea of cultural proximity, which argued that people will prefer national material first, but then secondarily regional. In fact, maybe just for fun, let's skip ahead. Okay, there. So let's look at this. I mean, look at the far left, which is kind of an average of all the countries. So an average of 59% of Latin Americans do in fact prefer national TV. But number two is not the region. Number two is the United States. And that was, a bit of okay, half of your theory was wrong. Which is, a thing that is kind of, academics don't like to discover that half of their theorization was wrong, that American imperialism really was more powerful than you thought. And so, I've been for a couple of years now since I got access to this tape. It's been making me think rather hard. Wow. Okay. So how do I go back and think about this? So so I think it's worth thinking about just, what all there is in the dominance of Hollywood over a century now, first in film and then later TV, which it enables it to stay so strong. And part of it is just the enormous, rich, market of the United States. Part of it is Hollywood's productivity, which I think you have to be honest about. It's a very productive cultural industry. Part of it is and here's where the political economic critique I think is incredibly important, was kind of a maneuver done both by Hollywood and also, frankly, the US government to reinforce the power of the Motion Picture Export Association over global distribution. Now, what was interesting to me when I first got into studying TV was there was kind of a hypothesis in the 60s and 70s in the US. There was an expectation, actually. Well, since we dominate film so well, surely we'll dominate television. And one of the things that's really interesting, it frustrates me when some of my colleagues insist on talking about audiovisual industries, because I've always found, particularly in Latin America, a very sharp distinction between television and film in terms of their industrial dynamics. And now, actually, there is a moment of convergence where it makes more sense to talk about them combined. But one of the things I'll talk about in just a minute is why TV was enabled to be more national. And to some degree, one of the factors on the cultural side, so much of this is pure political economy, and it's very important. But part of what happened, and I think the best summation I've heard of this is by Todd Gitlin, who said, partly because of Hollywood's dominance for so many decades, particularly in Europe, but generally, the US became everybody's second culture. And I think maybe that's too strong a statement almost, but I mean, Latin America and Europe are very similar in their TV dynamics right now. People do, in fact, like national TV best, but the US stuff is a very strong second. Emily Bonanno discovered that in her research on Europe a few years ago. And I think, so something that was created in film and still transferred into TV and then still powerful is people's, in fact, familiarity with American culture. Because I do think there's a kind of weird cultural proximity light, almost. So that's the first time I've used that term. You guys get to hear a new idea. So we have kind of cultural proximity at a very lightweight level toward the United States. It's a very familiar culture to many, many people because of this dominance of flow and dominance of distribution. But the other factors as well, the highly productive industry. You know, my colleague Tom Schatz talks about the genius of the system in Hollywood. And I'm not quite sure I'm willing to go that far. But it's an interesting point that there has been the continuing ability to gather resources to pull in talented people, including these days half a dozen very talented Mexican artists, and pull them into Hollywood to reinforce, in fact, in some ways, Hollywood's dominant position. But TV does actually create an interesting difference. So you've got, if you look at the factors on the right, fundamentally, governments control frequencies. So, you know, just an absolute point of technological, political, economic power if it's used well. And both Mexico and Brazil have used this pretty strongly. National limits on foreign ownership. Some other day I'll come give you my historical revision on Brazil, where I think it's interesting to see how that was played with in many ways. A lot of government incentives. I think in both Brazil and Mexico, TV would not have been so national so quickly if it hadn't been for a huge amount of government investment in microwave towers, satellites, et cetera. And so, and then all of that, and again, in terms of political economy, it's kind of an ambivalent factor, but honestly, you may not like El Tigre, Azcárraga, but he was a powerful entrepreneur who built a huge industry. Same with Roberto Marinho. I don't much like them, but on the other hand, and they certainly abused their power politically, and you know, all sorts of heinous things that were done. But on the other hand, they built very, very powerful industries, which had repercussion. And perhaps even more interestingly, they built very powerful industry genres and did in a way that I think government also has a lot of impact on. You know, governments also kind of, as all this communicative infrastructure was being built up, governments also used media, but schooling, national holidays, maps, all kinds of things. If you've ever read the Benedict Anderson book, The Imagined Community, all the things that he talks about, all the ways that a national imaginary, a national community is formed. In fact, if you haven't read that book, or at least some of the summaries, I highly recommend it. So I think between all those government efforts to create and reinforce national identity and the productive power of industry, and I think honestly, kind of an audience response to familiarity, because I think that was my part of what was kind of maybe a little bit original, the fact that there was an audience response to that which is familiar and relevant. I mean, my fundamental insight on that was just looking at how hard it was for jokes to travel. And actually, I had two moments. One was watching some Brazilians enjoy Mexican comedy and others not getting it. The other was realizing that half of my extended family in Idaho didn't even understand Monty Python. It was too British. In fact, they didn't even understand Seinfeld. That was too Jewish and too New York. And so, you know, it's interesting how cultural familiarity, relevance, proximity works. And I think a lot of forces work together to create that at a national level, particularly when there's a strong government that's working on this hard. And it has, you know, there was an era of you know, both cultural and governmental regulation, which I think led to very strong national TV industries. You know, there was a deliberate import substitution. There were lots of subsidies to production in different ways. In film, particularly, there were quotas. In fact, one of the things that we want to talk about later, if we have time, is that a number of countries, and the EU for certain, is now going to impose a 30% regional quota on Netflix. And Brazil is talking about imposing a quota on Netflix. It already has kind of small quotas on US cable TV and pay TV. And that will probably, it seems to me very likely that all the quota measures that were imposed on cable and transnational pay TV will now be imposed on Netflix sooner or later. So, and those can be reasonably powerful. So it's interesting if we come back to this. And so look at the not only the averages, but here's one that fascinates me. Mexico is a lot more nationalistic than Brazil. And I'm still scratching my chin and thinking about that, because the preference for national TV in Mexico is extremely high. Likewise, Chile. Brazil, it's a little lower at 55% rather than 68. And so, and if anybody can help me figure out Venezuela, other than the obvious Chavez factor, I would love to figure that out, because, you know, as it turns out, they're less interested in almost everything. I think TV to some degree has been chopped up by the regimes, first Chavez and then Maduro, pretty hard. And perhaps for good reasons. The TV companies had become part of the opposition. But as the people I know who study Venezuela closely, that, you know, a variety of economic and political factors led to a fall in Venezuelan production. And it's interesting. One of the things I do find fascinating here is that their preference for almost everything is less. US, national US. It's interesting, if you look closely at that, it's the one country in all of Latin America where the regional preference is as high as the national preference. Because I think what happened is they continued to want to watch telenovelas, and when telenovela production became very difficult within Venezuela, then they got used to watching things from the neighbors. And so I do think there is an incipient regional audience, and Venezuela is actually a case in point. And if you're interested, then a former Brazilian student of mine who'd been working in, I guess, regional audience study for cable TV, helped me get access to these data. And it's not perfect, because in many ways, the thing I want to call out is these figures are based on a study of large metropolitan areas, which are probably going to be biased toward more cosmopolitan and more highly educated people than the national average. So this in some ways is kind of a best case scenario for something like Netflix, and it probably underestimates some of the national interest that a really big true national sample would have. So, you know, I don't want to necessarily go into the details. We can do that later if you're interested. But the thing to keep in mind is that just surveying big metropolitan areas is quite a bit different than surveying a true national audience. So I think here's where I really kind of want to dive a little deeper into kind of how the new forces that in some ways Netflix represents are cutting in. So we still have this and I'm sort of trying out this as a new idea as well, that this idea of cultural regulation. I was asked to give an equivalent talk about a month ago in Estonia at a conference on cultural policy research. And a former student of mine was putting it together and said, I think there is a thing that I want to call cultural regulation. So talk about that. And I took that as kind of an interesting challenge, to think about how we can see that as essentially a structural factor. That the cultural forces are strong enough to form boundaries that are in fact structural. So, but now this new logic of Netflix, the logic of the algorithm that works across cultural boundaries to define and to some degree fragment and isolate individuals by their genre preferences. Like I'm sure there's probably 1 million science fiction time travel fans out there, kind of like me, who all liked El Ministerio del Tiempo, just because of the genre, even if they didn't know a thing about Spain. And so it's interesting to think how this is now, I think probably the word that keeps coming back to me as I think about it is fragmenting, but also kind of redefining a certain logic of individualization to a much, much more extreme level, but within a frame. This is not everybody in the world. This really is the upper end of the middle class and the elite of the world that's got access to this and that seems to be interested in it. So I really want to talk about that in some ways. I mean, on the other hand, government regulation is still both possible and even prominent. I mean, China is exercising an extreme form of cultural import substitution right now, not only restricting and controlling the US inflow, but as Korean stuff began to flow in, they also zeroed in and restricted that very heavily. So there's kind of a very strong nationalism and import substitution that's there in potential. Maybe a somewhat lesser version, like with the EU 30% requirement. The other thing that I think may well come to be, and again, we see it maybe first in the EU, is simply the regulation of these platforms. Well, again, frankly, China is the strongest regulator of platforms. Extreme import substitution. Netflix, Google, Amazon need not apply. They are not going to get into China, nor will Netflix. And so there is that as a very, very hard regulation. And I think one subtle thing that is definitely I've seen playing out in Brazil, and I'd love to hear what you all think about this vis-a-vis Mexico. One way to manipulate this and regulate it a bit is to subsidize production and kind of hold out things for Netflix to pick up. So 3%, which was one of their first big global hits, based in Brazil, drawing people out of Globo, people who wanted to do something different, was basically a pilot subsidized by a Brazilian government program to subsidize pilots, which is in some ways now more, how do I put it, industrially engaged. They won't give you money to subsidize your pilot program unless you have a tentative commitment from somebody to actually distribute it. They don't want to waste the money, in effect. So it's still government subsidy, but in a kind of slightly more neoliberal frame. But 3% did very well on that basis. It became one of Netflix's big international hits. And so I can easily see, now that they've had that successful experience, for them to use subsidy programs like the one in Brazil as kind of a development program that they can take advantage of. So a couple of quotes here that I won't necessarily read out. And if anybody wants the slides, I'll be happy to make it available. But in fact, oddly enough, I went home and read my email and discovered this great quote from Variety magazine last night on the left, which was that it's Variety observing Netflix pretty closely and summing up some of the more recent interference public announcements they've made and interviews they've given. And so they do, in fact, want to sort of take what they've already got in the United States and distribute it in very much an old-style Hollywood way. So in a very clear kind of political economic pattern. They're certainly going to do that. But they see the national production in Spain, Brazil, Mexico, many places, as something that's in some ways, not only can they have good national audiences, but then they hope that those will flow transnationally. which again, I think is maybe in some ways the newest thing that they're doing. So that quote on the right from a good recent book by Marieke Jenner about Netflix is that they're very deliberately looking at global, but they actually talk about them as transnational. So we have an interesting debate we can have about global versus transnational. And so in some ways, I think this is the meat of it in many ways. The algorithmic regulation of flows, very much aimed at individuals with a huge accumulation based on AI, based on big data, of information about individuals, so that you probably have the experience that I do. You open up Netflix and it's uncannily good. It's saying, oh, you'll like this and this and this. And you know, that's a function of an algorithmic survey of all the data they've accumulated on me, which is a little frightening. I mean, I began to be aware of that, I think, almost 10, 12 years ago when Amazon had an equivalent good line on what books I was going to like, you know, at least 10, 12 years ago. And they've sold me a lot of books over the years from that ability to manipulate the algorithm so well and to refine the algorithms. Now, it's interesting where it's going. It seems to be, we don't know exactly because they're fairly private about this, but they seem to be making a lot of decisions on content based on summaries of what they've learned algorithmically, what people like, what different genres, what the different audiences for those genres are. So they probably know in some aggregate way that there's people like me out there waiting to see something like El Ministerio del Tiempo. And so that's something they can do in their planning and their decisions on content. I mean, in some ways, it makes old-fashioned Hollywood look ridiculously amateur. Oh, here's an interesting proposal. We'll develop it. We'll literally throw it against the wall and see if it sticks. You know, Hollywood was pretty slapdash compared to this. And this is, I think, going to be, in many ways, much, much more systematic with all this data, which is a little frightening. You know, they're going to greenlight projects based on the way of this. I mean, in some ways, they have the same powers that Hollywood has always had. Even though they're highly globalized, they're pulling in lots of global material. The fundamental decisions on greenlighting the money, on deciding who gets funded, and the fundamental decisions on who gets distributed, I mean, they're still based, you know, in the US, very much like Hollywood, classic Hollywood. So if you look at, say, Toby Miller's analysis of global Hollywood, how it's distributed very broadly in its production, but with a couple of key functions still being very much centered in the US in terms of the ongoing, the kind of political economic change there. And they had two layers to that, I think. One is kind of the initial decisions based on a lot of data. The second is shaping the content. So once something is in play, once they've decided on a project, they'll give them a lot of feedback about, well, here's what we know from all our big data about the kind of audience you're doing, you're going after the kind of genre you're doing. Here's some things to help you shape a successful product. In a way, Hollywood does in a more kind of, in a less systematic way, let's say. And then the other thing which is huge for Netflix itself, they've discovered that what they call localization, which is essentially just dubbing, and well, it's primarily dubbing and subtitling, but it's also to some degree cultural shaping, adding elements that would make something more popular in a given region, again informed by to some degree the data itself. So I'm sort of trying out two concepts here. One is the familiar one of transnationalism. The other is this idea of transversality, that it cuts across the existing lines of flow. And it's interesting. They're finding fairly diverse, different sources. Like there's a huge fandom in the United States right now for Nordic dark mystery and crime stuff, which kind of amazes me because my wife studies Norway, and it has not much crime. So why is it that Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish producers are producing these dark crime stories? Well, it's because the international audience likes it. And so it's already before Netflix, you were seeing a shaping of national production and national genre by global audience expectations. And now I think what will happen with Netflix is it amplifies that transnational transverse flow and guides it with a lot more data. Well, just to take one example, so that some of you might have seen from Spain, La Casa del Papel, which is actually one of the bigger hits for Netflix in the United States even, because it's a familiar heist picture. And I don't know if everybody, if that term's familiar to everyone, but it's a subgenre, you know, the caper heist thing. And if it's interesting to look to see where it's popular. It's very popular in the United States. It's quite popular. It's even more popular in Europe. It's popular in Russia and China to the degree it gets through in China. It's not particularly popular in Brazil, interestingly enough. So, so I wanted to start there. Now I want to dive into, I think, what's the next really important part of this, which it has to do with economic transformation and class dynamics. So in some ways, I want to engage the political economy of this at another level, because I think it happened in a more lasting way in Mexico. In Brazil, it was a bit temporary. Chile, it's ongoing and transformative. Likewise, Argentina. The growth of the new lower middle class over the last 15 years. So I've seen data about Brazil where almost all of those people, because the World Bank had warned us in a couple of studies that this new lower middle class was not necessarily secure or firmly established. They could fall back into working class or even poor, which has sort of happened in Brazil, which may be one reason we're about to have the horrendous election of Bolsonaro. But because people are really, truly frightened and rattled, which is not a good excuse to vote for a man like that. So the visual here is something that really amused me, and I've seen this both in person and read about it. So you had the new lower middle class, which felt, you know, I'm middle class now. I may be young and black, but I'm middle class. So I get to go to the middle class mall. And it really freaked out the traditional white middle class of Brazil, that suddenly you had all these young people of color, you know, dressed in clothes that cost money, but not the clothes that they wore. And so you'd literally get what they called rolezinhos, little strolls. I remember going to a mall in kind of a town in the state of Sao Paulo, a nice affluent middle-sized town, Bauru, and there were literally policemen on horseback who cornered these guys who wanted to go into the mall into a little pocket, and were only letting a few of them go in at a time because the middle class had reacted really badly to this, and they'd called the police, and the police had called out troopers on horseback to control the new lower middle class. Really kind of frightening. And so I think it's a fact in much of the world. I mean, it's even more visible in China, maybe also in India, but this establishment of a new lower middle class, or a new middle class, and I've been looking again at the IBOPI data, and as well as some census data, and you can see moving upwards. So somebody who used to be working class is now lower middle class. The lower middle class person is now middle class. The middle class person may now have become upper middle class. And all of this now has an interesting dynamic. So I think when you begin to see people in the middle and upper middle classes, the first big change here we saw about 15 years ago, because for Brazil had amazed people in the industry for decades. Up until maybe 15 years ago, 5% of Brazil had subscribed to cable. That's a tiny amount for a fairly affluent country. And it was sort of a perpetual puzzle. Why so few people subscribing to cable? Part of it, frankly, I explained with cultural proximity. It's American stuff, only part of it subtitled or dubbed. Why would we expect them to like it? But then it began to change with this economic transformation. I guess that's part of my point, is that the transformation of the audience itself. So we have increased affluence, and here I'm going to become very Bourdieuian, increased economic capital, increased cultural capital. And when you connect cultural capital to this scenario, I think it gets really interesting, because it's not just more schooling, it's more knowledge of languages, it's more travel, and it's several sets of cultural knowledge that suddenly make American jokes understandable, that make American politics a bit more understandable, that make all these frames of reference that go beyond cultural proximity much more widespread. And so, like that Todd Gitlin quote I gave earlier, that the US is everyone else's second culture. That wasn't really true in Brazil for lots and lots of people, but I think it is becoming more true. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about that for Mexico, for instance. So if you look, for instance, at the effect of social class, The richest 10%, the next 20%, all are much more interested in American programming. On the other hand, even with the socioeconomic change, look at the red bar. It's absolutely even. Everybody still likes national material, and they like it strongly. If they're really in the upper middle class, they might like American stuff a little better, but that doesn't mean they don't watch telenovelas, and they don't watch the news, they don't watch comedy that they like, and other things. So, this change in cultural capital is sort of coexisting with still a very strong sense of national identity. And I think it's partly that people now know enough about other cultures to better understand and prefer. There's also an interesting thing of symbolic capital, another Bourdieuian idea that sometimes people consume things in order to have the distinction of displaying that taste. So I would hear my grad students in these seminars in Bauru and in Sao Paulo, the city, kind of showing off to each other. Well, I really like Orange is the New Black. Oh no, I think House of Cards is much more interesting. And there were these, displays of cultural capital, basically, to gain kind of distinction. So, I think in some ways it's still a very, very useful concept. Part of what people are doing here is gaining and displaying distinction. And they're indicating that they have achieved social mobility in an important sort of way. And again, you can see how that plays out with the relationship of both education as cultural capital and foreign language ability as cultural capital. So I think in a lot of ways, class stratification is part of what makes Netflix work. We now have a much bigger middle class and upper middle class with the cultural capital that comes with that to have a better, more knowledge and more interest in foreign programming. And okay, I've already mentioned that. It's interesting, the other thing that seems to be powerful when you look at some of the literature and the data is that this is very much a thing defined by generations. So younger people are simply more interested in most of these things than older people. But it's interesting to bring generation and class together so that I just did a pretty straightforward cross-tabulation here and discovered that, well, yes, but if you look among, say, the youngest, who are the biggest fans of videos, Netflix, foreign movies, etc., the ones who are the most elite, like look at that third horizontal line, if you're, not only young, but in the top, 10% of the income, your interest is much, much higher. So these things are very articulated in a way that, like Stuart Hall would talk about articulation, how class, race, and ultimately perhaps gender as well, kind of in the sense of intersectionality, come together. Now, and this sort of reflects, this is fun actually, it reflects a big debate in cultural sociology right now. Is this kind of phenomenon mostly about classic distinction in the Bourdieuian sense, or is it more about people becoming more cosmopolitan? And if that's a different thing, I think those things overlap hugely. But as it turns out, this data I've got actually supports the fact that if you look at people who are cosmopolitan in attitude, less nationalist, more fond of cultural diversity, more interested in other countries, and it could either be at a more abstract level, I sympathize with those countries, identify with them, I want to know more about them, or it could be pretty mundane. I like to eat their food, I like to travel, I like to buy stuff. So, within the theory of cosmopolitan, there's both kind of the more elevated and mundane. So look at this. I've been showing you graphs that reflect distinction. So look at that. Cosmopolitans like everything. So kind of in the new terminology, they're cultural omnivores. In fact, I felt kind of a little glow of satisfaction because the first time I looked at that, I said, wow, these guys are cultural omnivores. And then I started reading the literature and the literature says, yeah, they're cultural omnivores. So that's good. So, it's interesting to think, and I think, to drag this back to Netflix, I think this is Netflix's ideal audience, the cultural omnivore, the person who's become both middle or upper middle class in terms of class terms, but also more cosmopolitan in terms of attitude. I think in some ways we're looking here at the global, to use an American term, sweet spot, kind of the global target audience of Netflix. And, I think if we then look at that, as individuals within taste communities, and again, here's where it gets back to an interesting question of how is culture and culture flow regulated? The state has quite a bit of power, particularly if you're a state like China, or even a state like Mexico and Brazil. You're regulated by, to some degree, culture and language itself. There was this brilliant dissertation about 1 year before I did mine by a guy named Chin-Chuan Lee, who actually compared China, Taiwan, and Canada. And he said, look, paradoxically, teeny little Taiwan is much more culturally autonomous than Canada. So why is that? It's because there are barriers of culture and language that protect China that don't protect Canada, which I thought, wow, that's actually kind of a brilliant use of case study. And Netflix is I think, cutting across that. And they've done, and they're doing it with this kind of new platform-based algorithmic culture. So, you're probably, if you watch a lot of Netflix, they figured out that you belong to one of their 1,300 distinct taste cultures, which is really, really micro fragmentation of the audience. And it's, again, it's a little frightening because it recognizes a huge accumulation of data and a huge amount of huge ability of algorithmic culture to target you very narrowly. So this is not necessarily good. It's good in that it's convenient. In some ways, this reflects a big issue of big data and algorithmic culture. It's really convenient. It delivers it delivers what you like to you. It's in some ways, you have to do a lot less searching these days to find things that you're interested in. But just think of that accumulation of data in light of some of the comments that were made in the panel yesterday. So sort of summing this up a little bit, how are the TV flows going to change under Netflix? In some ways, it will be the US to everywhere increasing, but within a frame of social class. That how that's really going to happen isn't going to be to everybody. A poor guy in the middle of Amazonas or down in Chiapas is not necessarily going to be drawn into Netflix. Won't have the money, won't have the bandwidth, won't have broadband available to him, and probably will not even be interested. This stuff is just not so funny, so relevant, so comprehensible. So there is this enormous class frame. And if you want to think about implications, what do we get if Netflix really further globalizes the upper middle class to a very great degree across the world? I think that's an interesting question sociologically, and it's one where, to some degree, political economy, cultural dynamics, and even individual patterns of audience response come together in a pretty interesting way. I think what I'm calling these sort of transnational transverse flows are going to increase a lot. So, if you lived in the right Latin American country, you could already watch Korean and Turkish telenovelas. That's essentially what they are. Melodrama in some ways is this meta genre that works in the whole world. So with this new form of transnational flow, you can expect to see the best of everybody's melodrama, and that's probably going to be pretty popular. We'll see a lot of the best of everybody's science fiction, of their mystery and cop shows. I don't know whether humor will flow quite as well. Humor is really hard. But I think we're going to see, in a very targeted, algorithmically guided way, a huge amount of flow from a lot of different places. So in some ways, it's both kind of like the era of classic media imperialism in the 70s, but also unlike, because there's all these new layers of flow. It'll certainly be globalized in a sense. But on the other hand, there might actually be a slight increase in national production as Netflix also invests in that. On the other hand, a slide that I won't probably have time to show you, it's already having impacts. I don't know the impact it's had in Mexico, but Netflix is already making more money than the number 3 network in Brazil, called SBT. And SBT is already, SBT, Silvio Santos, is already a much bigger network than the next half dozen networks in Brazil. So if they're making more money than them and have a bigger audience than them, it's going to have some pretty big impacts in national television. So that I think we're just going to start seeing very soon. And we might even see a little bit of increased regional flow because again, when Netflix makes Ingobernable, they would like lots of people all over Latin America to watch it. Likewise, a Mecanismo from Brazil is a little particular to the corruption scandals, but that's not unrelevant to Mexico. That's, pretty relevant to lots of places actually. And so it'll be interesting to see that regionality versus the transnationality in a lot of ways. All right, well, I've probably gone on way too long. So thank you for your attention. Again, thanks to Florence for inviting us, and thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Muchas gracias a Joe. Creo que en sociedades donde se presume que pueden programarse algorítmicamente queda algo todavía más importante que esa supuesta programación, que es lo que nos gusta ver. No quiero detenerme más, así que abrimos el micrófono para ustedes si hay preguntas para Joseph Straubhaar. Aquí hay una, y ¿les parece bien si juntamos 2 o 3 preguntas para que pueda responder y luego seguimos con otra ronda? Gracias.
Gracias, Joe. I like a lot your presentation. You really figure out in a nice way the structure, the flows, the audiences, and how Netflix is breaking some kind of models of production and distribution. So really, I like it a lot. Sí, me gustó mucho. Yo simplemente me gustaría como pedirte un poco que profundizaras en la importancia de la distribución, ¿sí? Porque justamente si además de todas estas formas innovadoras de ir creando el algoritmo en función de los gustos de la audiencia, que por cierto son datos privados que no conocemos de Netflix, o sea que también ahí hay una información valiosísima para la investigación de las culturas contemporáneas y del consumo televisivo audiovisual fundamental, que sería muy importante que lo compartieran. La importancia de justamente cómo conseguir saltarse a las compañías de cable, saltarse a las networks y conseguir una distribución global. Justamente en los años 90, quien hacía énfasis de la importancia de la distribución era Nicholas Garnham, donde decía, ahí es donde realmente está el poder de poder conseguir dominar los mercados audiovisuales. Y eso hasta entonces quien lo había conseguido de manera muy importante, bueno, ya lo pusiste tú, fueron las majors. Y tanto que las majors ahora están muy preocupadas porque lo saltó Netflix, ¿no? Pues un poco simplemente como profundizar por ahí y subrayar la magnífica presentación que nos acaba de hacer y para que se den cuenta también nuestros estudiantes, este es un ejemplo muy importante del estudio de la comunicación internacional, ¿no? Que me parece que Joe es uno de los grandes exponentes a nivel global.
Oh, gracias. Okay, let me go back to English. I understand Spanish well, but sometimes my delivery is not as elegant as I would like, so I will respond in English. Should we take some more? Okay, gracias.
Antes de pasar al micrófono para allá, también quería hacer la pregunta. You talk about the cosmopolitan consumer. ¿Podrías definir más cómo se categoriza?
Sí.
Para entender cuál es, o sea, cómo está formado, ¿no? De qué edades, cuáles son sus gustos y consumos y por qué se está volviendo como un objetivo tan importante para Netflix, por ejemplo, ¿no? Generar, o sea, entender sus consumos y generar más este tipo de consumidores.
Okay, let me respond to these two, because if I get three or more, I'll probably
Sure.
lose track. So, so first to Ricardo, Rodrigo. Precisely, keep wanting to call you Ricardo. It's interesting. I think in some ways, cable in the rest of the world had a much bigger impact than it had in Latin America, except in Argentina and Colombia, where TV networks weren't really allowed to develop in the same way. And so, I mean, it's interesting if you look at those, at the exceptions, which make the rule sometimes. Network TV developed really powerfully in most of Latin America. So you had these enormous companies like Televisa and TV Globo or Venevisión or others, which I think in many ways developed such sophistication and such a strong financial base that they could do programming that was, I remember literally interviewing people about this in Brazil. I was curious, why aren't you interested in cable? In fact, I actually got interested the first time in this in Dominican Republic. I was there in 1988, 89 on a Fulbright. And I noticed people had a cable wire going into their house. And they also had a video cassette, both of them covered in plastic and the plastic covered with dust. I thought, okay, they're not actually using this. And I remember it's one of those moments where Bourdieu helped me figure it out. This has symbolic capital, but they're not actually engaged with it. It's not that interesting to them. They want to display a middle class status, but it's not culturally engaging. So I think in many ways, you know, the era of cable just wasn't that powerful in Latin America outside of Argentina and Colombia. In part because it was too American, too crude, not adapted enough, not really localized in a meaningful way. I mean, using localization in the sense that when a big company like a Murdoch or a Time Warner or somebody comes in, they resist adapting their stuff. They want to just sell you what they have. But they begin to realize that certainly they couldn't expect Latin Americans to watch in English. They couldn't even expect Argentines and Mexicans to watch the same Spanish. And so they begin to sort of adapt things somewhat, to localize things somewhat. But it was still, until maybe this really big economic jump took place, starting, depending on the country, in 2000 or so. So I think what happened is that the distribution was delayed until an economic transformation took place. So that would be one thought to emphasize, that, you know, in some ways there was a potentially globalizing distribution mechanism with cable and satellite. And it had much less impact here than in most parts of the world. It had a huge impact in Europe, huge impact in India, huge impact in Saudi Arabia and places. Not in Latin America. And so, particularly not Brazil, and not so much even in Mexico. So just, I mean, it's an interesting reflection on technology. Technology is not powerful in itself. Technology is powerful when it's adapted to social use and when it makes a connection with people and enables them to do something they want to do. And so I think this transformation of class to some degree was the thing that then makes cable now interesting for a lot of people, because say in rural Brazil, you're not going to get Netflix, but you can get cable or satellite. And so suddenly there is actually a new power to those older technologies. But in the cities, then if you do have broadband and you do have you know, access in economic terms, then this new generation of distribution technology is, I think, a genuine leap, because it enables people to, I mean, the classic phrase in the United States in marketing is people want to watch what they want to watch, when and where and how. So, and I think that had been a level of individualization and customization and also just ease of technology use that arrived here somewhat later than in the US. But particularly with people who have now been transformed both culturally and economically by some economic growth, then that distribution technology can be really powerful. Then I think it's interesting why this is seemingly having such an almost like a thunderclap. It's just like, you know, wow, why are we having this amazingly strong technological moment? Well, I think in part it's because in Mexico and Brazil at least, you know, the society is now prepared culturally, socially, and economically for that to have this new distribution effect. And so I think it's both very individualizing in the way that we talked about this new mode of distribution, which I think really challenges a lot of the both industry and regulatory models. I mean, if you're trying to regulate the flow like in China, because before the Chinese cracked down, there were years and years and years where Chinese would download, say, something like Friends. You know, I kind of hated the show, but incomprehensibly to me, Friends was seen as American modernity for a certain generation of people about 20 years ago. So, you know, didn't speak to me, but spoke to a lot of people. So people in China would download it, unpack it, apply subtitles that somebody else had created. There were clubs for making the subtitles, and it was effectively bypassing. That also happened in Brazil. It probably happened here as well. You know, groups that subtitled American stuff informally. And in fact, the same student who got me access to all this data actually asked me he was working for DirecTV Latin America about 15 years ago, and he says, it's weird. Nobody else, there are 500,000 people in Sao Paulo who really like Friends. The rest of the country, no. So we're not doing so well with Friends in Brazil. It's just, you know, Brazil would probably go, you know, doesn't speak to me. But these 500,000 people in Sao Paulo really like it. And it was one of the points where it got me thinking again, somewhat in Bourdieuian terms, you know, who has the cultural capital, who has the status, knowledge. And I started sort of interviewing some of those people. He asked me to do a small report for him. So I flew down and interviewed some people. And it was an interesting complex of higher education, travel, exposure to things international within the family, working with foreign people in companies and universities. So there were all these things that made somebody into kind of a person who was structurally different. They had cultural capital, they had economic capital, they had linguistic capital. And now, kind of to your question, we then also have, and I'm not quite sure of the relationship. I can understand the Bourdieuian distinction logic very well. I mean, we've all been studying that for 30, 40 years now. And it makes sense, it works. I mean, it explains a lot of things. I mean, even 20 years ago, I noticed that about the same time that I proposed the idea of cultural proximity, I could see that this was the limit. Because people who were of a certain kind of elite, cultural proximity was not a big deal to them. They were already prepared to like British or US or Japanese culture just as well anyway. I mean, because it's not limited to the US, I would walk around Sao Paulo and look at the Bancas de Jornais, and they would have they have translations of very elite American and Japanese comics. So there were youth in Sao Paulo who were fully prepared to really like all this avant-garde, high-quality comics coming in from these other cultures. And so it was, so I think there's a parallel dynamic, which I need to understand better, frankly, myself. How it is that a cosmopolitan political attitude, or to use Bourdieu, a disposition to be, you know, I mean, the simplest way to put it is that people at some point become less nationalistic and more desirous of being a citizen of the world. I remember giving a seminar in Italy about 10 years ago, which had students from MA students from all over Europe. And there was one Serbian girl and one Swedish girl who both just virulently denounced their nationality. They did not want to be. Well, everybody in the world wants to be Swedish other than this one girl. But you know, she was tired of being Swedish. She wanted to be a citizen of the world. And the Serbian, okay, a little easier to understand. You know, it was not a good time to be Serbian. But it made me reflect, because I mean, I've felt that same thing for a long time now, in some ways ever since secondary school. You know, American? Do I really want to be American? You know, in the way the rest of the world looks at Americans? Nah, I think I want to be more of a citizen of the world. I mean, I remember thinking that thought. And so I think, and it tends to happen kind of at that level with, you know, kind of coming to identify with people who are not your same nationality. So losing nationalism to some degree. And again, there's a lot of literature on this, and I'm reading into it, but I'm kind of not as far into it as I'd like. So there's that. There's kind of an abstract, kind of losing nationality, beginning to think about being more cosmopolitan in that sense, you know, because it goes way back. It's a Greek concept, cosmopolitis. And so it's somebody who's kind of lost their nationalism. But then there's another level of kind of solidarity, you know, sympathy with starving people in Africa, people with sympathy with refugees, sympathy with people who are in difficult circumstances. And in both cases, a desire to know a lot more about those people. And so that's going on. And then kind of at the level of tourism, I really like traveling to places like Europe and China. I really like eating their food. I like to buy their stuff, you know, and so there's this kind of banal or mundane aspect of it as well. And I think in some ways, if you think of it as kind of nested layers, you kind of have to get to an upper middle class status before you can even begin to have these attitudes. So I think once you've achieved this kind of transformation to being in the upper middle class, then I think this is a thing that happens. And it's interesting, when I bring both of this back to Netflix, I think Netflix gains from both dynamics, because I've definitely seen in my Brazilian students a really classic display of cultural distinction. Well, I know this and you don't. Or I'm so sophisticated, I like these obscure Danish, you know, things. And, but also then, just people who really are the cosmopolitan. Wow, this is also interesting. I don't have enough time to watch all the interesting stuff there is on Netflix from everywhere. And I've kind of literally heard both of those expressions. So, you know, I've got the quantitative data that seems to lay this out, but I also, when you hear people speak about it in a more kind of ethnographic way, you can really see that this is becoming a genuine thing. And particularly when I teach at Bauru, these are not people in the traditional elite. These are by and large people with working class parents who've made their way up through, you know, a really quite good public school system in Sao Paulo. And oddly enough, for those of you interested in public media, when I began to interview these people, a lot of them credited public television in the state of Sao Paulo, which is the only Brazilian state that has had a genuine good public television. And they had become kind of both socially mobile and to some degree increasingly cosmopolitan. And I think it's a process, you know, where it comes together is education and travel and learning of languages. You know, the classic cultural capital and the new cosmopolitan sort of come together in those experiences. Okay, too long an answer, but good question. Great question.
Recogemos otras preguntas.
Buenos días, felicidades por su presentación. Estados Unidos invirtió mucho dinero para conquistar la Luna en los años 60. Muchos años después vemos que las grandes corporaciones de comunicación han invertido mucho para conquistar ese planeta, que son las audiencias. E iría más allá, diría que para conquistar el tiempo libre de las personas. Me parece que uno de los cambios cualitativos más importantes que ha habido es que ver la televisión ya no es una actividad social y familiar, de sentarse en la sala de la casa a ver la televisión con toda la familia, sino que Netflix ha entendido muy bien dos factores que parece que pudieran influir en esta nueva forma de ver la televisión. Por una parte, que en la forma de ver la televisión se encuentra el estatus mismo de lo que se está viendo. La parte aspiracional no se encuentra solamente ya en ver el contenido al que uno aspira como televidente, sino en cómo ve uno la televisión, en qué clase de smartphone ve uno y en qué plataforma ve uno los contenidos que está proponiendo Netflix. Entonces, me parece que por una parte es muy interesante ver cómo la tecnología le permite a la empresa generar los algoritmos y los CMRs para identificar y segmentar mucho la audiencia, pero también para aprovechar que la televisión ahora es una actividad que se ve encerrado en su cuarto con un celular o en el transporte y con unos earphones, unos audífonos puestos. Ya no es una actividad fundamentalmente individual, más que social. Y por otra parte, bueno, pues también entonces por ese lado, que la parte aspiracional no solamente viene ya en el contenido, sino también en la forma de ver la televisión, que revoluciona completamente la manera de verla y sobre todo en donde la parte del consumo no solamente ya está en lo que se ve, sino en cómo uno tiene mejor streaming cada vez para consumir mejor lo que Netflix ofrece. Y lo segundo, pues que también gracias a la tecnología ellos han entendido o han aprovechado esta posibilidad de tener interacción con el público, con los algoritmos y con la tecnología de poder conocer los gustos del público, también para incorporar en la nueva tripulación para conquistar esos planetas a astronautas locales. Es decir, poder tener la sensibilidad de incorporar programación que les sea relevante a las audiencias regionales y que se identifiquen muy rápidamente, hasta producciones que los identifiquen con problemas contemporáneos y con situaciones que quisieran expresar, pero que normalmente medios tradicionales no lo pueden hacer, como es el caso de Ingobernable en México, ¿no? Gracias.
Gracias. Let me speak to that. It's interesting. So I think, for instance, something we didn't talk about, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a huge wave of really interesting anthropological research about TV, about what people watch TV, particularly how they watch TV together. It was kind of the era of mass TV dominated by Televisa and Globo and these big national companies. And they very much discovered, I think, several important things, which are still true. This is the interesting part. The hypotheses that I'm going to give you is that I think TV is multi-layered, multinivelado, and that I think the audience and audience identities are equivalently multi-layered. Because the thing that the anthropologists discovered was that there's a strong cultural continuity when you get to the home, when you get to the village. And there's a desire to see in the daily life, the cotidiano. You know, you don't necessarily want to see a Netflix movie. You probably want to see something you can share with the family. So there's this strong desire, and also just at the level of almost civil society. You want to have a certain number of things that you can talk about. I mean, the United States has gotten to a really dangerous point, I think, in our civil society, where everybody is so one term is siloed, you know, where everybody watches an entirely different form of TV and consumes entirely different news, entirely different information. I mean, yeah, and that's politically for us. It's part of what accounts for the election of Trump. There's very little that's shared in a broad way across civil society right now. A little bit of entertainment, news, much less. And I think in most other countries, I would say, certainly from what I've seen in Mexico, and I know Brazil better. So, I mean, even a rich banker probably watches the Jornal Nacional, you know, on TV Global, just to know what people are talking about, and probably watches the 9 o'clock telenovela because people do talk about that. If he doesn't watch it, he probably reads the summary in the newspaper. I mean, I've actually interviewed literally 2 bankers over the years who have this strategy of, okay, I know my tastes are much more elite. You know, I travel a lot. You know, I could be becoming less Brazilian, but I don't want to and I can't. I need to share a certain amount with my family, with my extended friends, the people in my neighborhood. I mean, everybody lives a local life and everybody still lives a national life in interesting ways. And so I think, you know, again, you look at the government and industry side, people have put a huge amount of lots of work at various levels and ways into creating a national identity, reinforcing it, and media is a very big piece of that. So, and I've talked a lot with some of the other people doing similar kind of research, like this professor in Italy, Milo Buonanno, who's done great work on this. And so the argument is that, and oddly enough, I observed it in 6 months in Denmark, which I spent about 10 years ago, because Denmark's a tiny place. And everybody speaks English. And my wife studies Scandinavia, and she's been telling me for years that they fear that their languages and cultures will disappear. I mean, they're already kind of secondary Anglophones. They speak English really well. But on the other hand, what happens at a certain level, like Denmark, is that languages begin to have domains. So in Denmark, English is the domain of science, business, academic research, and I'll just give you an ethnographic example. So I taught for half a year in Aarhus, Denmark, at a good university. And we'd have the faculty canteen, and they'd all be in there joking, laughing, flirting, having a great time in Danish. And I would walk in, And they would switch to English and be very correct, and we could talk about professional things, but they were no longer joking, laughing, and flirting. I mean, they were, that was, so one way I think about it is I think for many, many people, the national and the local is the domain of affectivity. The emotional, the interior life, the daily life. And frankly, you want a continuity in that life. And again, a lot of this comes from either my own observation and interviewing or a lot of the kind of more ethnographic research that's been done. So that's one layer. And then there is another layer of the commonality of regions. Latin America, to some degree through TV, has come to know itself a little bit more as a region than it did, say, 50 years ago. And I don't think that's going away, although that, I think, is under pressure. The space for that might actually be diminishing, at least on television. That's kind of what the research seems to show. And then we have these new spaces. We've always had this space of, it seems like from the research, both old and new, the space of global TV, particularly American TV, but also British and some others, continues very strong. And then there's this new thing of the transnational. And I'm not quite sure that's what I'm working on understanding right now, honestly. And I'm not sure. And the interesting thing is it now has, first in cable TV, and even now much, much more with Netflix, the technical support that it hasn't always had. And so I think in some ways, if you imagine, here's a space of nationalism, national identity. When I frequently use a chart, I say, okay, here's the local. Everybody has a local life. Here's the national. Almost everybody wants to maintain that national life. Here's the regional, depending on the place. In some places like the Middle East, regional TV is more important than national TV because there's so much shared with Arabic, Islam, etc., that regionalism, really actually makes more sense. And it's so it varies in the world a little bit, and then we have this familiarity with American and British and a few other things that have had this traditional flow. And it'll be interesting to see how the combination of computer and internet access, and I think you put an interesting thing on this. This is now highly individualized. And it's mobile. People can watch this on their tablets or cell phones. I literally watch students as soon as I'm not talking, out comes the cell phone, and I don't know if it's social media or a TV show or whatever, but as soon as they're not paying attention, there they are. And like one of my favorite recent jokes is, I don't know if this happens in Spanish, but there's a joke form in English about Saint Peter at the gate of heaven periodically reporting to God about what the new people are like. So in the latest version of this joke, he says, the new people are very weird. They sit there looking at their hands and they're very sad. They're missing their cell phones, They're in heaven, but they're missing their cell phone. And so it's an interesting how far this individualization goes. I think we don't quite know. And it may be that it starts to absorb those other layers of nation and region and locality. But I think in some ways, those things will still be there. They'll just come through the same mechanism. And so will you get Mexican programming from Televisa or maybe from Netflix? Or more likely both. So I think, it'll be interesting. But that individualization, I think, is a huge dynamic. And I think, frankly, it's dangerous in many ways. We're already suffering from it politically, more than you are. And so I think in some ways to use another American analogy, we're the canary in the mine shaft. When the gas in the mine gets bad and the canary dies. U.S. right now is kind of the canary in the political fragmentation mine shaft. The extreme individualization, as is now technologically possible, is not doing us a lot of good. And so, and again, that's more about news and political discussion. But I wonder how it will also extend into the kind of realm that Netflix operates in, which is much more about entertainment and culture. I do think people are going to remain more localized and nationalized in news and in political discussion. But that can also be pretty fragmented, and the same technology can help do the fragmentation. I mean, one reason our election in 2016 was so fragmented was between Twitter, Facebook, highly fragmented TV news. I mean, the world of Fox News is very different than the world of MSNBC. Kind of, you're not quite sure you're in the same country. And so that degree of individual and group fragmentation is, to me, one of the frightening things of this. Not to mention at the individual level, privacy, knowing that Netflix knows so much about me. And I don't really control that information, they do, as several people noted yesterday.
Joe, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Mientras hablabas, me surgieron algunas preguntas que quiero compartir contigo. Siempre, es decir, creo que hay una tensión entre la producción y la distribución, porque efectivamente en un momento dado la distribución es muy importante para hacer crecer a las empresas, para que los productos lleguen a donde deben llegar. Pero en otro momento, cuando esto ya está establecida, esta red, entonces deja de ser vital tener la red y pasa a ser mucho más importante tener los contenidos, porque sin la red, sin los contenidos, esa red está vacía y finalmente no sirve de nada. En el caso de Netflix creo que es claro porque empezó como una red de distribución y hoy no solamente distribuye, también produce y produce cada vez más y en distintos niveles y con distintas visiones nacionales, géneros, etcétera. Esa es una pregunta que quisiera que abundaras al respecto. Y otra es esto que me parece muy interesante, que surge de precisamente el análisis de cómo Netflix y en general la industria de la cultura estadounidense, hollywoodense, ha permeado a todo el mundo, pero cómo esta finalmente se trata de una cultura de clase media y clase media alta. Y en la medida en que esta cultura se ha generalizado en el mundo, bueno, esta es una pregunta, no tengo la respuesta, pero a ver si la podemos dilucidar. ¿Será una de las razones que puedan explicar el comportamiento político conservador en ciertos países, es decir, por qué la clase media y la clase, no solamente la clase media, sino la clase más abajo, es decir, las clases populares, un gran segmento de esas clases, están votando por opciones de derecha? Sí, lo estamos viendo en Alemania, en Europa, lo estamos viendo en Brasil, ¿no? En un momento dado lo vimos en México. Entonces, ¿tendrá alguna relación? ¿Cuál sería el peso de esta cultura que tú le llamas upper media class culture o Netflix culture o en las opciones políticas y la visión política de las grandes, pues, de las mayorías? Gracias.
Yeah, let me start with the last part first, because the part that the political implication that I see clearly from something like Netflix is that if you're making the upper middle class and upper class increasingly, or if you're reinforcing them, let's say, you're not really making them, but you're reinforcing them in being less national, more cosmopolitan, less necessarily linked in day to day to the interests of the rest of the society. So it's kind of a political stratification that maybe certain key part of your population, I mean, in some ways, actually, it fits really well with the idea from dependency theory of dualistic development. You have, you know, a working class that's very much attached to the national, but an elite that gets more attached to the global economy and global culture. I mean, in some ways, that idea has been there implicitly, at least since dependency theory. And I think now it's just a much bigger group of people. I mean, at the time, it might have been talking about a few people who own companies. You know, they were that internationalized elite that fit into dependency. But now you're talking about 30% of the country, 40% maybe. So it's in some ways on a much bigger scale now. And so the thing that I worry about really concretely is kind of the detachment from the national in some ways. So I think that has big political implications. And where it does come in, I think, to the right-wing politics. So I'm sort of improvising here. I haven't fully thought this through. So maybe this is total, you know, maybe this isn't a good thought. But if you look at some of the qualitative studies that have been done in the last 2 years, one in Wisconsin, another one in Louisiana that I can think of, by political scientists who've been out interviewing in the countryside. And they find there's a real anger of masses and against elites, and they will use the word cosmopolitan in a very negative way. Those cosmopolitan guys in Madison, they don't understand what it means like to be on a dairy farm in rural Wisconsin. And which to me is kind of shocking, because I'd always thought of Wisconsin in the United States as being part of a classic democratic farmer worker kind of coalition, you know, dating back to the New Deal. And so if those kinds of rural people, so some of the cleavages we're seeing in the U.S. is urban-rural. The rural don't trust the urban elites as they see them to share their interests or to do things that benefit them economically. And I do think the right has played on that. I mean, part of Trump's discourse, frankly, was it aimed at those people. Don't trust the urban elites, even though I am an urban elite, you know, right? You know, the band of the people, yeah, who was born with a silver hoof in his mouth. So, okay, sorry. I shouldn't let my anger at Trump spill into an academic meeting. So, but still, I mean, it's actually very talented as a politician, and he's very good at playing to resentment and anger. And there are an awful lot of angry, resentful working class people, and a lot of angry, resentful rural people, at least in the United States. And I think I think Brexit illustrated kind of the same thing in Great Britain. It's a very similar coalition of angry people who felt themselves excluded from the benefits of globalization, excluded from the benefits of information technology. I mean, some of us have benefited enormously from that. Probably everybody in this room is a beneficiary of both globalization and information technology. But there's an awful lot of people who aren't. And so, you know, so I think there are some studies being done that show that some of the same fragmentation and stratification that's kind of implicit in what I'm talking about plays into politics and is there to be mobilized by media. You know, both social media, but, you know, people have been trying to tease out after our election, for instance, how much of the impact of mobilizing people for Trump was due to social media and how much of it was due to good old-fashioned television news like Fox News. And the weight of evidence seems to be on the side of TV news, actually, that it had a broader, deeper, more long-lasting impact. Although social media were mobilizing people around images that were very current and contemporary, images and discourses. So yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And I think to the degree that some of these new technologies will further amplify. I mean, I literally put a Facebook note up one day about how much I was enjoying TV from Spain, and one of my nephews sent me a note and said, "What's wrong with American TV?" I went, okay, well, yes, there's nothing wrong with American TV. And I realized, okay, I was now, in his mind, one of those distrusted cosmopolitan people from the city. And I went, so it's, okay, and then to the earlier part of your question, I think a lot of the big entertainment and media industries, I mean, in the US at least, are a little panicked by the vertical integration of Netflix, their ability to do, as you called out, both produce and distribute on this really massive scale. And if I were them, what the thing that they don't seem to be thinking about. So when AT&T buys Time Warner to compete with Netflix, which I think is a really stupid idea. It's not really a conglomerate that's going to actually effectively compete with Netflix. I mean, it's panic. But there's a lot of panic in the American industry outside of things like Hulu and Netflix and so forth. They don't really quite know how to properly compete with it. And I think there's two problems. One is the technical mechanism, the internet distribution. The other is Netflix's emerging style of vertical integration of production and distribution. But the other one that I don't think they've really identified is Netflix's really thoroughgoing globalization. I mean, Netflix is trying really, really hard, really, really quickly to produce a lot more stuff outside the United States. I mean, they've gone from maybe 20 shows the first year to 50 shows. Now they want to do more than 100 shows outside the United States. And because they see huge advantages in that. I mean, they don't want to be just media imperialism. If we go back to the layers I was talking about, I mean, they would make money at that. But I think in some ways, they're very clever and very globalized in their thinking. And they realize that, okay, we want to do much better than Hollywood studios or TV from the US have ever done about really being truly global and making money everywhere. And not only making money on the export of American stuff, but making money on, un mecanismo, ingobernable, all these things, Club de Cuervos, all this, I mean, a variety of stuff that not only does well in Mexico and Brazil, but would very likely do well elsewhere. And so there's a very new business model that's much more thoroughly globalized. And I think that's frankly what the rest of American industry hasn't really figured out at all. And that, in fact, I don't even think they're aware of the issue. I don't see them talking about it. They're aware of the technological advantages. They're aware of the vertical integration. I don't think they've quite really truly absorbed the globalization of the model. Which I think, and once they figure that out, that will be interesting, because then there'll be a whole new scramble to merge with other companies in the world. So, I mean, one thing that could happen as a result of the rest of the industry's reaction to this could be this huge scramble for global conglomeration. I mean, that's really speculative, but if I were AT&T, I'd be thinking, well, yeah, if I merge with Time Warner, I'm now better vertically integrated in the United States, but what about all this other area that Netflix is conquering very quickly that I'm not prepared to deal with very well? Because, I mean, the Hollywood majors basically see the world as an export market or as a place to produce pieces of their movies. And I don't think they've quite taken the step toward fully integrating it and thinking of, I mean, I've had students actually write dissertations about why the Hollywood majors sometimes produce things in Brazil or Mexico or elsewhere. And so the pattern's there, but I don't think they've fully absorbed it in the way that Netflix has. So that's another thought.
Escuchamos una última pregunta para poder cerrar la conferencia magistral.
Bueno, a mí me quisiera plantear dos asuntos. El primero, me llamó mucho la atención la forma en que está bien articulada la presentación entre una visión, digamos, macroestructural general de los flujos de las redes de Netflix, pero también cómo se compensa eso, digamos, con una parte etnográfica, incluso en algunos momentos hasta anecdótica, que hace ver de manera más compleja o más completa el asunto. La pregunta es, esta es una presentación, ¿desde dónde o cómo se plantearía esta articulación más consistentemente en cuestión teórica y metodológica para el estudio de estos fenómenos, ¿no? Entonces, por un lado, sería ese. Y por el otro, si hay alguna hipótesis, porque se ha hablado de estas audiencias cosmopolitas y de la movilidad social y tal, pero si hay alguna hipótesis o cómo van los trabajos actualmente sobre sobre las audiencias infantiles de Netflix, porque, por ejemplo, a mí me llama mucho la atención, ahorita que hablaban de los dispositivos, por ejemplo, tengo unos sobrinos que cada uno tiene su tableta y entonces ellos hacen la curaduría de su programación con la única restricción, digamos, de que es el Netflix infantil, ¿no? Que les pusieron ahí sus padres el bloqueo, pero que también ellos pueden acceder, digamos, a esa construcción y eso finalmente también va educando a las audiencias, ¿no? El amigo de 3 años de una amiga está ahorita loco con un programa chino de un carro de bomberos que yo no sabía ni me hubiera imaginado antes de un programa chino. Entonces, así como alguna vez Plaza Sésamo nos enseñó a ver la televisión y a comportarnos como audiencias en el sistema que convenía, digamos, a estos productores, no sé qué hipótesis hay al respecto sobre estos consumos diferenciados que están teniendo las audiencias infantiles y que además, digamos, la única cortapisa de los padres es moral, es decir, no hay una revisión, simplemente se entrega el dispositivo y les preocupa, digamos, en asuntos de moralidad sobre el tipo de contenidos que van a ver, pero no hay ninguna otra preocupación respecto a esto. Entonces serían esos dos aspectos.
Buena pregunta. Okay, so yeah, that's a really, in fact, that's maybe my next project. So I'm not fully really engaged in it, and I don't have a lot of data yet. But but that's a really interesting one because simply by being a grandfather with 7 grandchildren under 8 years old, I watch a lot of TV with the grandchildren, and so this is kind of in a very kind of very incipient ethnographic way, but it's really interesting to me how fully globalized kids TV is, both in YouTube and Netflix, because an awful lot of kids watch a lot of stuff on YouTube. And some of it is dangerous in a way that was discussed yesterday, like advertising mixed with entertainment in ways that that kids are not prepared to deal with. So that I can say that, but I don't have much more to add. But I think what is interesting is that you look at the enormous number of things that are both pure entertainment, but also educationally entertaining. I mean, one of the models in the world that's really, really powerful actually is the old model of BBC and then also Canadian TV, of having stuff that's both entertaining and educational at the same time. So the US did that with Sesame Street and things like that. And so I think it's interesting to look at a lot of things that are produced in places like India or China or Korea, which are done in English. They're using English and American nursery rhymes. They're using things that are very familiar as conventions from things like Sesame Street. But they'll usually have a main locutor, a main narrator that speaks with a nice English accent or American accent. But all the chorus are going to sound like, oh, these kids are from India, or these kids are from China, or these kids are from Korea, or maybe, in some cases, Latin America, or Middle East. And so it's interesting to see how there's kind of a rapid kind of global imitation of forms that are coming from a variety of existing children's programming. And so a ton of little programs about trains, and trains that teach you your letters, and nursery rhymes that teach you letters and math and so forth. And 90% of the time, the ones I was watching were done in India. And my grandchildren infinitely prefer those to Sesame Street or BBC or Canadian, classic Canadian kids TV. And because they were very short, they were entertaining, they were well done technically. And so there's a form that I've noticed a lot that's very short form on YouTube, and very globalized. And so I think a lot of children are consuming a lot of that. And what's almost more interesting is then, you get, I think, very clever identification by age. Like I was watching things with my 7-year-old granddaughter, and she is very tuned into fantasy with powerful, interesting roles for girls. And so those tend to be, a couple of them are American. Disney is sort of trying to get into this, but a lot of them were like Danish, Norwegian, Italian co-productions. And some of the ones that she liked best were the co-productions from Europe, or 1 or 2 from Asia. And they all had lots of princesses. They all had lots of unicorns and flying horses. And they were very cosmopolitan in a sense that I'm kind of trying to understand, because the kids would be from varieties of places. I mean, sometimes real children, sometimes cartoons, but an enormous diversification. I think going back to Netflix, I think if you look at one of the places where it's already most transnational, most effectively transnationalized, is actually children's TV. Because there's a lot of children's TV on Netflix, just like there's a huge amount from all kinds of sources on YouTube. And I think it was fascinating for me to watch. Okay, so I got to sort of doing just sitting with the nieces or the grandkids, you know, let's explore what's on Netflix, you know, and so we explored a lot what was on Netflix, and it was interesting to see what they resonated to. And so for the 7-year-old, it's very princessy. You know, we want to see princesses who are beautiful, but they also do lots of interesting things. And 80% of it was not from the US, nor England. I mean, it was other newer coalitions of production. And so I think it's kind of fascinating what's going on precisely with kids TV. I think it's already much more globalized than we realize. And you know, and in terms of the impact of that, you know, for my one case of my 7-year-old granddaughter, she doesn't seem to care too much. You know, she kind of wants them to speak with an English and with an American accent, but that's where Netflix steps in with dubbing. So I'll give you one example. So, what's it called? It's Ladybug and Cat Noir. Two 10-year-olds, so some people know about those. So 10-year-old kids who are superheroes when they're not going to school. And it turns out in real life, she has a crush on him in their superhero lives. He has a crush on her, but they don't know each other's identities. And so it's very charming, but it's also set in Paris. And there's a French version, which is very nice French. And there's an American dubbed version, which sounds very normal to an American kid. Very transparent. She was, you know, I asked her, are you noticing that what city do you think this is in? And she says, well, I don't know. It's got the Eiffel Tower, so it must be Paris, right? And I went, yeah, that's good. And so, but to her, you know, and I remember another study that, in fact, a Mexican student of mine did, that there was a kind of threshold of age, about 8 or 9, where kids begin to be more aware of nationality in programming. And it'll be interesting to see if that sort of threshold does in fact play out. But I'm kind of guessing that kids who grow up with this fully transnational kids TV may then have a different attitude about national versus transnational as adolescents and possibly even adults. So yeah, that is a great question. Go get a grant and do research on that, because that is one of the big questions of global TV in the next 5 years, you know, 10 years. I think it's a really, really interesting, kind of important question. Because, you know, I mean, we sometimes think abstractly, is there a kind of a cohort effect? Do kids, when they experience things a certain way, remain changed by that? Or is it just generational? Here's what you do when you're 7, here's what you do when you're 15, here's what you do when you're 25. And you'll come to resemble the other kids in your country who did things at 7, 15, 25. But I wonder now, you know, with this so globalized kids TV, what the lasting impact will be, if there is a lasting impact. Maybe they grow out of it and they start watching American teen shows anyway. But yeah, I wonder, actually. Plus, being where I am teaching the students I do, they slip back and forth between Spanish and English a lot. You know, about 30% of my students are Latino. And so for them, it's a very fluid world between US TV, Latino and Latin American TV, and some other international stuff. So, but that might be a special case. I'm not sure. But really interesting question, actually. That because you know, I'm really curious. In fact, I'm going to try to start doing some research on this myself. Although I have a lot on the plate, as you say. But I think that's one people ought to be researching right now, actually, because I don't think we really fully understand what's going on in kids programming. And in fact, I was just watching you. It's funny. Oh yeah, I know all about Cat Noir. So this is a very real thing. And if you extend it into one more thing with the YouTubers YouTubers are seemingly still kind of national. I mean, there's a very lively Brazilian YouTube scene with famous Brazilian YouTubers. Same with Mexico, as far as I can tell. So there will be nationalization of things, but then I kind of wonder how far the transnationalization will carry. All right, thanks.
Parece que hay una última pregunta y tomamos un receso.
Muchas gracias. Muy brevemente,
Sí.
felicitarlo por su notable exposición y preguntarles hasta ahora cómo están enfrentando, si es que lo están haciendo, las políticas culturales, esta apuesta de Netflix, de las OTTs, por el cosmopolitismo o la transnacionalización cultural. Gracias.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I mean, if you look at kind of de facto, both formal government cultural politics and kind of de facto politics, I mean, there's still a huge support for nationalism, and in the EU regionalism, with the quotas for regional content. And I've just read an article literally yesterday where Netflix has said, "Oh, you want 30% European? We'll go buy it." I mean, they're really going to just watch for the headlines. There will now be a buying spree of Netflix from a variety of TV producers all across Europe. Because, I mean, to them, it doesn't actually harm their strategy. You know, they would probably have gotten to 30% European a bit more slowly, but I wouldn't have been surprised if in 10 years they hadn't already been 30% European just as a matter of strategy, to harvest, in their sense, to utilize all that good programming that could be marketed to their international audience. So, yeah, and I think what's interesting, and this is kind of back to the question that Florence asked, that's, because in theory, cultural policy should be for the whole country, for all the different social classes. And that's one of the things I don't quite see, or that I see becoming more difficult. Because if you have this increasingly transnationalized cosmopolitan group, like you growing up, how will you address them and working class people at the same time? That I think is a really interesting question. And it may be that people, I mean, frankly, formal cultural policy tends to be concerned with upper middle and upper middle classes anyway. I mean, I just went to a big meeting on cultural policy research, and I was a little staggered coming away from the meeting thinking about how elite all of this was. There weren't too many people talking about cultural policy for working class people. And so I think one problem from just the tradition of cultural policy is it's a little blinded and a little elite. But I think actually a problem that national cultural policy makers and even regional ones like in the EU will have is how do we not see alienated workers turning to the new nationalist right? I think they are, I mean, a really scary thing in the world right now is the ability of racially motivated nationalist politicians to take advantage of resentment that's class-based. And it's not just class-based. One thing that's become clear, as a white man, maybe I can say this more interesting, there's a lot of resentment by people who don't have any class basis for it. They're just white men who are seeing some part of their privilege reduced. So I can say that because, I've benefited from that in my life, I suppose. I try not to benefit it from it consciously, and I was really gratified the other day. In fact, the nicest thing anybody said to me in the last 2 weeks was one of my South Asian colleagues looking at me and said, Joe, I just want to tell you something that I've never thought of you as a white man. And I went, good. I'm really glad to hear that. But I think the mobilization of both class and gender and racial kind of resentment and animosity is a pretty real thing right now. And I think cultural policy, along with more political strategy, has to address that. How do we rebuild some sense of national common interest and national commonality? That should be done with culture and entertainment as much as with news. And so, yeah, that would be I think the thing I'm worried about, or the thing that I would like to see policymakers concerned with.
Muchas gracias, Joe. Gracias por esta plática. Gracias a ustedes. No sé si le quieren dar un aplauso a Joe.
Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. Muchas gracias a ustedes por su paciencia. La tercera y última mesa del coloquio empezará a las 12. Es la mesa de industrias culturales en América Latina. Parece que no es a las 12, sino a las 12:30 para que se puedan tomar un descanso un poquito más largo. Nos encontramos acá. Muchas gracias. Gracias por su paciencia. De nuevo, gracias, Joe.
Okay, well, that was fun. Seems like a lot of good questions, yeah. Oh, yeah. And good questions from the professors. I thought, okay, that's a good sign. Yeah. Thank you, I appreciate that.